Idi Amin, Uganda's brutal despotic dictator documentary. Welcome to our documentary on one of the most notorious dictators of the 20th century, Idi Amin, the brutal ruler of Uganda. Born in either 1924 or 1925 in Koboko, Uganda, Idi Amin would become infamous worldwide for the violence and oppression of his regime, which spanned nearly a decade from 1971 to 1979. His rise to power and the devastating impact of his rule continue to cast a shadow over Uganda's history. Amin was a member of the small Kakwa ethnic group in northwestern Uganda and had very little formal education. He joined the King's African Rifles, part of the British Colonial Army, in 1946, beginning his service as an assistant cook. Interestingly, despite his later claims of fighting in Burma during World War II, military records show that Amin's service only began after the war in 1946. Nonetheless, he quickly rose through the ranks, demonstrating physical prowess and a ruthless nature. Amin served in the British action against the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya from 1952 to 1956, establishing himself as one of the few Ugandan soldiers promoted to officer rank before Uganda gained independence in 1962. By the time Uganda's new prime minister and president, Milton Obote, came to power, Amin had become closely associated with him and was appointed chief of the Army and Air Force, serving from 1966 to 1970. But tensions between Amin and Obote soon began to simmer, and on January 25, 1971, Amin staged a successful military coup, overthrowing Obote. Amin declared himself president and took control of the armed forces, consolidating power with each passing year. By 1975, he had made himself a field marshal, and by 1976, he declared himself Uganda's life president. Amin ruled Uganda directly, refusing to delegate power. He was known for his erratic behavior and abrupt changes in mood, often swinging from buffoonery to brutality, from a surface-level gentleness to outright tyranny. His intense nationalism was evident in his drastic actions. In 1972, he expelled all Asians from Uganda. This move led to a breakdown in Uganda's economy, as the country lost a significant portion of its business community. Amin's behavior and policies often drew global attention. He publicly insulted major powers, including Great Britain and the United States, as well as numerous world leaders. A Muslim himself, Amin severed Uganda's previously amicable relations with Israel, instead befriending countries like Libya and supporting the Palestinian cause. His relationship with radical elements was apparent in 1976, when he became personally involved in the hijacking of a French airliner to Entebbe, leading to the infamous Entebbe raid. Under his rule, tribalism became even more pronounced in Uganda. Amin allegedly ordered the persecution of several ethnic groups, including the Acholi and Lango, taking tribal tensions in Uganda to horrifying extremes. His brutality earned him the nickname Butcher of Uganda, with estimates suggesting that around 300,000 Ugandans lost their lives under his rule, and countless others endured torture and persecution. In October 1978, Idi Amin ordered a military attack on Tanzania, a decision that would lead to catastrophic consequences for his regime. Fueled by Ugandan nationalists, Tanzanian troops ultimately overpowered the Ugandan army, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. As the Tanzanian-led forces advanced toward Kampala, Uganda's capital, Amin fled the country on April 11, 1979. Just 2 days later, he was succeeded as president by Yusufu Lule. After a brief escape to Libya, Amin eventually settled in Saudi Arabia, where he would spend the remainder of his life. Now let's take a step back and explore the broader history of Uganda. This landlocked country, situated in East-Central Africa, has a rich and complex history, shaped by diverse peoples and cultures. Uganda's borders, established in the late 19th century by colonial powers, were drawn in an arbitrary manner, encompassing two fundamentally different types of societies. In the south, the centralized Bantu peoples contrasted sharply with the more decentralized Nilotic and Sudanic peoples to the north. The country's varied ecosystems range from the tall volcanic mountains along its eastern and western frontiers to the densely forested swamps of the Albert Nile River and the rainforests that blanket the Central Plateau. Kampala, Uganda's capital and largest city, is a vibrant metropolis that stretches to the shores of Lake Victoria, Africa's largest lake, and the principal reservoir of the Nile River. This discussion will focus on Uganda's history since the 19th century, touching on notable events and figures that have shaped the nation. For those interested in a more detailed treatment of Uganda's early history and its regional context, additional resources on Eastern Africa are recommended. Brief overview of the early history of Uganda. The early history of Uganda, much like that of sub-Saharan Africa, is a tale of migration, as small groups of cultivators and herders traversed the land over centuries. Cultures and languages evolved continuously as peoples migrated, settled, and intermingled. By the mid-19th century, when the first non-African visitors arrived in the region that would later become the Uganda Protectorate, several distinct languages and cultures were already established within its territory. The northern areas were predominantly inhabited by groups speaking Nilotic and Sudanic languages, while the central, western, and southern portions were primarily occupied by Bantu-speaking peoples. The kingdoms of Bunyoro and Buganda played pivotal roles in shaping the history of Uganda. The organization of the peoples inhabiting the area north of the Nile River was primarily rooted in their clan structures. In contrast, the communities to the southwest of the Nile exhibited a different social organization, one characterized by the establishment of states, or kingdoms, as they were labeled by the earliest European visitors. At the forefront was the dominant state of Bunyoro Kitara, which emerged at the end of the 15th century. Under capable leadership, Bunyoro Kitara extended its influence eastward and southward, encompassing a vast territory. This kingdom was marked by a unique blend of religious and secular authority, with rulers fulfilling both priestly functions and those of political leadership. To the south of Bunyoro Kitara, several lesser states were established, each governed by a chief who shared similar roles. However, the smaller state of Buganda began to rise as an offshoot of its larger neighbor to the southeast. By the end of the 18th century, the expansive boundaries of Bunyoro Kitara had stretched so far that the authority of its rulers began to weaken. This decline was compounded by a succession of less assertive chiefs, which accelerated the kingdom's diminishing power. Meanwhile, the more compact and strategically situated state of Buganda was experiencing a renaissance of its own. It boasted a line of able and aggressive Kabakas, rulers, who capitalized on Bunyoro Kitara's vulnerabilities, expanding Buganda's influence at the latter's expense. As the dynamics between these two kingdoms evolved, they set the stage for the intricate and often tumultuous history of Uganda in the centuries to come. It was during the period of Buganda's ascendancy that the first Swahili-speaking traders from the east coast of Africa made their way into the region in the 1840s. Their primary objectives were the lucrative trades in ivory and enslaved people. In 1856, Kabaka Mutesa I came to power and opened Buganda to the outside world by admitting European explorers, including the Briton John Hanning Speke, who crossed into the Kabaka's territory in 1862. The encounters between Buganda and European explorers continued with Henry Morton Stanley, the British-American explorer, who arrived in Buganda in 1875. During his visit, Stanley met Mutsa I, who, while his kingdom had not faced direct attacks, was acutely aware of the threat posed by slavers from Egypt and Sudan to the north. These slavers had been ravaging the neighboring Achoiland since the early 1860s. Following the death of Kamrasi, the ruler of Bunyoro, his successor Kabarega, managed to defeat his rivals only with the assistance of the slavers' guns. At this critical juncture, an emissary from the Egyptian government, Linant de Belfond, had reached Mutesa's palace before Stanley, further highlighting the Kabaka's desire to secure allies. Mutesa, I was eager to strengthen his position, and readily accepted Stanley's proposal to invite Christian missionaries to Uganda. However, upon the arrival of the first agents of the Church Missionary Society in 1877, the Kabaka was disappointed to discover that these missionaries had no military interests or ambitions. In 1879, representatives of the Roman Catholic White Fathers Mission also reached Buganda. Although Mutesa III sought to limit their influence and movements, their presence and outreach rapidly spread through interactions with the chiefs whom the Kabaka kept close. Inevitably, the missionaries became intertwined in the political landscape of the kingdom. Mutesa I initially appeared unconcerned about these new influences. When Egyptian expansion was curtailed by the Mahdist rising in Sudan, he adopted a firm stance, dealing brusquely with the small contingent of missionaries in his territory. However, Mutesa I's successor, Mwanga, who ascended to the throne in 1884, faced a much more challenging situation. Unlike his predecessor, Mwanga's attempts to expel the missionaries and their supporters ultimately led to his deposition in 1888. This marked a significant turning point in Buganda's history, as the kingdom navigated the complexities of foreign influence and internal power struggles. Mwanga, having been restored to his throne with the backing of both Roman Catholic and Protestant Uganda, soon found himself confronting the onslaught of European imperialism. In 1889, Karl Peters, the German adventurer, brokered a treaty of protection with Mwanga, but this arrangement was short-lived. The Anglo-German Agreement of 1890 declared all territory north of latitude 4° to fall within the British sphere of influence, nullifying Peters's treaty. As a result, the Imperial British East Africa Company stepped in to administer the region on behalf of the British government. In 1890, Captain F.D. Lugard, acting as the company's agent, signed another treaty with Mwanga, placing Buganda under the company's protection. Lugard also secured treaties with two other chiefs, who were the rulers of the western states of Ankole and Toro. However, the company soon found itself unable to maintain its administrative role due to financial constraints. Consequently, in 1894, the British government, motivated by strategic interests and pressure from missionary sympathizers back in Britain, declared Buganda a protectorate. The British inherited a country fraught with divisions, as Uganda was torn apart by politico-religious factions that had erupted into civil war in 1892. Buganda faced additional threats from Kabarega, the ruler of Bunyoro. A military expedition in 1894 successfully stripped Kabarega of his stronghold, forcing him into a life of exile as a refugee for the remainder of his time in Uganda. By 1896, the protectorate encompassed not only Buganda but also Bunyoro, Toro, Ankole, and Busoga, with treaties established with chiefs to the north of the Nile. Mwanga, who resisted British control in 1897, was once again overthrown and replaced by his infant son, marking a significant transition in the leadership and governance of Uganda under colonial rule. In 1897, a mutiny among the Sudanese troops employed by the colonial government prompted Britain to intensify its focus on the Uganda Protectorate. In response to the unrest, Sir Harry Johnston was commissioned to visit the country in 1899 and to provide recommendations for its future administration. The pivotal outcome of his mission was the Buganda Agreement of 1900, which established the framework for British relations with Buganda for over half a century. Under this agreement, the Kabaka was acknowledged as the ruler of Buganda, contingent upon his loyalty to the protecting authority. The Kabaka's Council of Chiefs, known as the Lukiko, received statutory recognition. The leading chiefs were the primary beneficiaries of the agreement, as they not only gained greater authority, but were also granted freehold land, securing their support for the negotiations. Johnston further negotiated a less detailed agreement with the ruler of Toro in 1900 and subsequently made a third agreement with the ruler of Ankole in 1901. As British administration expanded, efforts were made to reach the northern and eastern regions of Uganda. However, in these areas, where centralized authority was absent, No formal agreements were established. Instead, British officers, often aided by representatives from Uganda, directly administered these regions. By 1914, Uganda's boundaries had been defined, and British control had extended over most parts of the country, marking a significant consolidation of colonial governance in the region. In the early 20th century, Sir James Hayes Sadler, who succeeded Sir Harry Johnston as Commissioner of Uganda, recognized that the region was unlikely to attract European settlers. His successor, Sir Hesketh Bell, envisioned developing Uganda as an African state, a vision that faced opposition from several senior officials, notably the Chief Justice, William Morris Carter. Carter chaired a land commission that continued its work until after World War I. The commission repeatedly urged that provisions be made for European planters, yet their efforts yielded little success. Despite this, Bell laid the groundwork for a peasant economy by promoting cotton cultivation, which had been introduced into the protectorate as a cash crop in 1904. The revenue generated from cotton significantly contributed to Uganda's financial independence from British Treasury grants in 1914. As World War I commenced in 1914, Uganda experienced minor skirmishes with German forces along the southwestern frontier, but the region was never seriously threatened by invasion. However, the war did disrupt the country's development. In the aftermath, it was decided that the protectorate authorities should focus on expanding African agriculture, leading to the encouragement of coffee cultivation alongside cotton. The British government's decision to prohibit the alienation of land in freehold, coupled with the economic depression of the early 1920s, further dashed the hopes of European planters. Consequently, the roles of Europeans and Asians shifted primarily toward the commercial and processing sectors of the protectorate's agricultural industry. As primary produce output increased, the need for improved communication infrastructure became apparent. Just before World War I, a railway was constructed extending northward from Jinja, on Lake Victoria, to Namasagali. In the 1920s, the railway from Mombasa on the Kenyan coast was extended to Soroti, and by 1931, a rail link was established between Kampala, the industrial capital of Uganda, and the coast. The economic progress of Uganda faced interruptions during the early 1930s due to the global depression. However, the protectorate's recovery was notably quicker than that of its neighboring countries, and the latter years of the decade saw a period of steady expansion. In 1921, Uganda saw the establishment of a legislative council, though its limited membership, comprising 4 official and 2 non-official members, resulted in minimal impact on the protectorate's governance. The Indian community, which played a vital role in the region's commercial activities, was particularly aggrieved by their lack of equal representation alongside Europeans on the unofficial side of the council. Consequently, they chose not to participate until 1926. Interestingly, there was little interest among Africans to join the council, as the politically progressive Ganda community prioritized their own Lukiko, viewing it as the most significant governing body in the country. Given the lack of enthusiasm from Africans toward the protectorate legislature, it was not unexpected that they resisted proposals for closer union between the East African territories during the late 1920s. Their opposition stemmed partly from an interest in preserving tribal traditions, but also from apprehensions, shared by both Africans and Asians, about potential domination by the European settlers in Kenya. A notable shift occurred with the burgeoning interest in education by the government. In 1925, the Protectorate administration established an education department. While they provided support to missionary societies that had already opened several reputable schools in Uganda, the government also took steps to create its own educational institutions. This initiative facilitated the gradual replacement of older chiefs, often strong-willed but lacking a Western-style education, with younger, Western-educated individuals who were better equipped to implement government policies and were more compliant with British authority. Moreover, in Uganda, the administration began to take a more active role in the kingdom's affairs, aiming to enhance efficiency. However, This intervention led to a decline in respect for non-Bugandan chiefs, resulting in some chiefs feeling resentful of the diminishing of their traditional powers. During World War II, from 1939 to 1945, Uganda's protectorate faced the challenge of striving for self-sufficiency. The war years prompted Governor Sir Charles Dundas to shift the focus from the restrictive policies of his predecessors, aiming to provide more autonomy to the power factions within Buganda. However, this approach was short-lived, as unrest and rioting erupted in 1945, leading to a revival of previous policies. That same year marked a significant milestone with the first Africans nominated to the Legislative Council. Over the subsequent years, African representation steadily increased. A key advancement occurred in 1954, when the number of African Council members rose to 14 out of a total of 28 non-official members. These representatives were selected from districts that were considered more natural units for representation than the provinces that had previously been in place. In 1955, a ministerial system was introduced, with 5 non-official African ministers out of a total of 11. However, the effectiveness of the council was undermined by Buganda's inconsistent participation. Many Bugandans perceived the central legislature as a threat to their autonomy. This apprehension was compounded by the earlier deportation of Mutesa II in 1953, who had refused to collaborate with the protectorate government. Although he returned 2 years later as a constitutional ruler, the relationship between Buganda and the protectorate government remained cool. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the protectorate administration prioritized economic and social development over political progress. From 1952 onward, there was a rapid expansion of secondary education, coupled with the enactment of legislation and the establishment of a loan fund designed to encourage African participation in trade. A relatively ambitious development program gained momentum, bolstered by the high prices for cotton and coffee. By 1957, coffee had surpassed cotton to become Uganda's most valuable export. Additionally, 1954 saw the initiation of a significant hydroelectric project at Owen Falls on the Nile, near Jinja, and in 1962 a comprehensive 5-year development plan was announced. In the late 1950s, as political parties began to emerge, the African population in Uganda intensified its efforts to achieve self-government, focusing on the Legislative Council. During this time, the Kingdom of Buganda intermittently sought independence from Uganda, raising critical questions about the future status of the protectorate. Discussions held in London in 1961 culminated in the establishment of full internal self-government by March 1962. Benedicto Kiwanuka, a Roman Catholic from the Ganda ethnic group and the former chief minister, became the first prime minister. However, in the elections of April 1962, he was displaced by Milton Obote, a Lango who led the Uganda People's Congress, UPC party. Further discussions in London in June 1962 resulted in an agreement granting Buganda a significant degree of autonomy within a federal framework. As Obote's UPC emerged, claiming support across the nation except in Buganda, the Democratic Party, DP, which was rooted in Buganda and led by Kiwanuka, gained traction. In response to these developments, conservative Ganda leaders formed a rival organization called Kabaka Yeka, KY, meaning King Alone. Uganda achieved independence on October 9, 1962, but the nation was politically fragmented, divided both geographically and ethnically, setting the stage for the tumultuous years to come. By accepting a constitution that effectively granted federal status to Buganda, Milton Obote forged an unlikely alliance with the Ganda establishment. This partnership allowed the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, and Kabaka Yeka, KY, to form a government, with Obote serving as prime minister and the Democratic Party, DP, in opposition. In an attempt to further unify this coalition, Obote appointed Mutesa II as the country's first president, replacing the British Governor-General. However, this move proved unsuccessful in alleviating tensions. Despite Obote's efforts to win over members of both KY and DP to join the UPC, tensions escalated between the Kabaka and the UPC. Uganda leaders grew increasingly frustrated with their inability to dominate a government that was primarily composed of members from other ethnic groups. Within the UPC itself, divisions emerged as each member of parliament owed their election to local ethnic supporters, rather than to their party affiliation. This led to pressure from constituents seeking to rectify perceived imbalances in the distribution of resources and benefits resulting from independence. In light of this dissatisfaction among his followers and the rising hostility from Buganda, Obote took drastic measures. In 1966, he arrested 5 ministers and suspended the constitution, leading to outrage among Uganda leaders who demanded his removal from their kingdom. In response, Obote dispatched troops, commanded by Colonel Idi Amin, to arrest the Kabaka. Mutesa Dao managed to escape to England, where he died in 1969, after abolishing the kingdoms and imposing a new republican constitution, which included appointing himself as executive president. Obote lost significant support from the southwestern Ugandan populace. The political landscape became increasingly fraught with internal friction, marked by mutual suspicion among rival groups, assassination attempts against the president, and oppressive governmental tactics aimed at silencing dissent. At independence, Uganda's export economy was thriving, benefiting from high demand and prices for coffee without negatively impacting subsistence agriculture. To address criticism regarding the equitable distribution of export profits, Obote attempted in 1969 to broaden the benefits of the flourishing economy. He published a Common Man's Charter, focusing on dismantling the remnants of feudalism by having the government acquire a majority stake in larger, primarily foreign-owned companies. Additionally, he proposed a new electoral system in 1970, which required successful parliamentary candidates to gain votes from constituencies beyond their home districts. These proposals, however, were met with skepticism and cynicism, and ultimately, Obote's government was overthrown before they could be implemented. Relying heavily on the loyalty of Amin, Obote had inadvertently set the stage for his downfall. Amin, who had been consolidating support within the army by recruiting from his own Kakwa ethnic group, now found himself at odds with Obote. As tensions flared, Amin seized the opportunity presented by Obote's absence from the country in January 1971 to take power in a coup. Amin's coup was initially met with widespread relief and optimism, as many believed it would pave the way for a more unified Uganda. Several Western nations, including Britain, welcomed Amin's rise to power, fearing the spread of communism under Obote's increasingly leftist policies. Amin promised a return to civilian governance within 5 years, but it soon became clear that his leadership would be fraught with problems. Lacking a Western-style education and formal military training, Amin frequently resorted to arbitrary violence to maintain his grip on power. In a shocking display of brutality, he orchestrated a massacre of senior army officers loyal to Obote, effectively dismantling any potential center of opposition. This set a precedent for Amin's regime, which would be characterized by fear and repression. To solidify his support among the Ugandan populace, Amin ordered the expulsion of all Asians who had not taken Ugandan nationality in 1972. This drastic measure won him considerable approval, as many Africans perceived the Asians as exploiters who controlled vital sectors of the economy. However, this action also isolated Uganda from the international community, leading to economic downturns. Wealthy Ugandans benefited briefly, but the majority of the businesses previously owned by Asians fell into the hands of senior army officers who mismanaged and ultimately destroyed these enterprises. In the countryside, the fertility of Uganda's soil allowed many people to continue growing food, helping them to survive the total economic collapse that ensued in the mid to late 1970s. In urban areas, a pervasive black market emerged, and dishonesty became a necessary means of survival. This widespread economic and moral decay sparked growing criticism of Amin's government, and the nation faced numerous coup attempts during this tumultuous period. Desperate to divert attention from Uganda's internal crises, Amin launched an ill-fated attack on Tanzania in October 1978. The Tanzanian military, bolstered by armed Ugandan exiles, swiftly defeated Amin's demoralized forces and invaded Uganda. As Tanzanian troops closed in on the capital, Amin fled the country, marking the end of his tyrannical rule. In April 1979, a coalition government of former exiles, known as the Uganda National Liberation Front, UNLF, took office, with Yusufu Luli, a former prominent figure in the Democratic Party, DP, as president. However, due to internal disagreements over economic strategy and fears that Lul favored his own Ganda people, he was replaced in June by Godfrey Benaisa. Benaisa's administration was also short-lived, as supporters of Obote plotted his overthrow, leading to Obote's return to Uganda in May 1980. In December 1980, Obote's party, the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, secured a majority in highly controversial parliamentary elections. While the Democratic Party, DP leadership reluctantly agreed to serve as a constitutional opposition, Yoweri Museveni, who had played a significant role in the military overthrow of Amin, refused to accept the UPC's victory. Instead, he and Lule formed an opposition group known as the National Resistance Movement, NRM. Museveni led the movement's guerrilla faction, the National Resistance Army, NRA, and embarked on an increasingly effective campaign against Obote's government. Supported by the International Monetary Fund and other external donors, Obote worked tirelessly to rebuild the economy. Initially, his efforts showed promise, but they were soon undermined by extraordinary inflation stemming from a pervasive black market. Urban wage earners struggled to keep pace with rising prices, and salaried civil servants grew increasingly frustrated with the government's failure to adjust their pay in line with economic realities. Meanwhile, the guerrilla war gained momentum, bolstered by its base in Buganda, where people were already suspicious of Obote's leadership. The conflict intensified as an ill-paid and poorly disciplined army, predominantly composed of Acholi and Lango soldiers, wreaked havoc on the countryside. This army not only looted, but also sought revenge on their long-standing Ganda enemies, exacerbating the situation. The internal divisions within the army, particularly between its Acholi and Lango members, contributed to Obote's downfall. In 1985, Obote was overthrown and went into exile, paving the way for an Acholi general, Tito Okello, to seize power. However, this shift could not halt the momentum of Museveni's NRA. On January 29, 1986, Museveni became president, marking a new chapter in Uganda's tumultuous history. During the drafting of a new constitution, an indirectly elected National Resistance Council, dominated by the NRM, functioned as the national legislature, establishing a new political landscape for the nation. Museveni in office. Facing challenges similar to those encountered by the UNLF in 1979 and Obote in 1980, Museveni announced a policy aimed at moral and economic reconstruction. However, enforcing this policy proved difficult. Sporadic military resistance persisted, especially in the northern and eastern regions of Uganda. With arms readily available, dissatisfied individuals were willing to resort to violence to achieve their goals. Despite Museveni's injunctions, the NRA sometimes dealt with opponents in a manner reminiscent of Obote's forces. Nevertheless, security improved in most areas of central, southern, and western Uganda, and observers noted that human rights were more widely respected. In 1993, a constitutional amendment restored the monarchies, and the Ganda, Toro, Bunyoro, and Soga crowned their traditional rulers. The new constitution was promulgated in 1995, and presidential elections were held in May 1996, where Museveni easily secured the majority of votes. He was subsequently re-elected in 2001. During the 1990s, Uganda experienced an increase in rebel activity, particularly from the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, led by Joseph Kony. Established in the late 1980s, the LRA kidnapped and enslaved tens of thousands of children, forcing them to serve as soldiers or servants in their fight against Museveni's government. The LRA's brutal assaults on civilians in northern Uganda, characterized by rape, murder, and horrific mutilations, instigated a humanitarian crisis, displacing over 1 million Ugandans by the early 2000s. After years of refusal, the LRA agreed to meet with government officials for peace talks in late December 2004. But those discussions collapsed in early 2005, prompting the LRA to resume its attacks. Peace talks resumed in July 2006, leading to a ceasefire agreement in late August, though negotiations to end the decades-long conflict continued sporadically. In late 2008, Uganda began a joint military operation with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, and South Sudan to target LRA bases. However, the poorly executed campaign ultimately failed to capture or kill Kony, allowing the LRA to disperse and continue its acts of terror across northeastern DRC, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. Although Uganda's economic growth garnered praise from Western nations, inflation and unemployment remained significant issues in the early 2000s, largely due to the country's reliance on fluctuating agricultural markets. In an effort to boost regional economic activity, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya established the East African Community Customs Union on January 1, 2005, later joined by Burundi and Rwanda in 2009. Oil discoveries in the early 2000s further bolstered economic forecasts for Uganda. In a 2005 referendum, Ugandan voters overwhelmingly supported a return to multi-party politics. Despite having long opposed multi-party democracy, fearing it would exacerbate ethnic divisions, Museveni embraced the referendum results under pressure from international donors. The following year marked the country's first multi-party election since 1980. A constitutional amendment that eliminated existing presidential term limits also passed in 2005, allowing Museveni to run in the 2006 presidential election. Representing the NRM, he was re-elected, although allegations emerged that Kizza Besigye, leader of the Opposition Forum for Democratic Change, FDC, had been imprisoned in the months leading up to the election to impede his participation. Besigye was eventually released in January 2006 and contested the February election, managing to secure nearly 2/5 of the vote despite his loss. The 2011 presidential election featured Museveni and Besigye as the two leading candidates. Museveni was re-elected with 68% of the vote, while Besigye garnered 26%, rejecting the results. His rejection was supported by international monitors who noted an increased military presence on voting day that intimidated voters and reported cases of bribery involving ruling party members giving gifts and money to election officials. Corruption, a long-standing issue, continued to plague the country. Despite appearances of progress in combating graft, little meaningful action was taken. A former head of Uganda's anti-corruption court criticized the focus on low-level cases, while high-ranking officials often evaded accountability for corrupt practices. In the years leading up to the 2016 elections, speculation grew regarding whether President Museveni would once again represent the National Resistance Movement, NRM, as their presidential candidate. There were whispers that he was grooming his son, Brigadier Muhoozi Kainerugaba, as a potential successor. This speculation gained traction in 2014 when Museveni dismissed Amama Mbabazi, the prime minister. Once a close ally of Museveni, Mbabazi was considered the second most powerful figure within the NRM and a strong contender for the presidential nomination. In early 2015, Mbabazi announced his intention to challenge Museveni for the NRM presidential nomination, but later decided to run as an independent candidate, citing attempts by the NRM to block his efforts. On February 18, 2016, Museveni faced 7 challengers for the presidency, with Besigye and Mbabazi being the most prominent. Museveni was declared the winner with approximately 60% of the vote, while Besigye received around 35%, and Mbabazi garnered less than 1.5%. The announcement of Museveni's victory was marred by complaints about missing voting materials that delayed the electoral process in opposition strongholds and allegations of widespread voting irregularities. Some international observers criticized the electoral environment, highlighting a climate of fear and intimidation, along with the repeated detentions of Besigye by the police. Besigye, the Forum for Democratic Change, FDC, and other opposition members declared the election results to be fraudulent. In March, Mbabazi filed a petition with the Supreme Court, seeking to have the election results nullified due to the alleged irregularities. However, the Supreme Court dismissed his petition later that month, acknowledging evidence of some irregularities, but asserting that they had not significantly impacted the election's outcome. Meanwhile, in parliamentary elections held concurrently, the NRM retained a two-thirds majority in the legislature. In late 2017, following contentious debates, Parliament voted to amend the Constitution, removing the presidential age limit of 75 years and reinstating a two-term limit. This amendment allowed Museveni, then 73, to run for two more presidential elections. Although the amendment faced legal challenges, it was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court in 2019. As anticipated, Museveni was the NRM candidate for the 2021 presidential election. There were 10 other candidates. However, perennial opposition leader Besigye chose not to run this time. Museveni's most formidable challenger was Robert Kyagulanyi, a 38-year-old lawmaker and entertainer popularly known as Bobi Wine, who led the National Unity Platform, NUP. The campaign period was overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictive measures in place. Government security forces frequently dispersed opposition rallies and protests under the guise of enforcing COVID-19 restrictions, although critics noted that NRM rallies were often exempted from similar scrutiny. Notably, Wine was arrested multiple times for allegedly violating COVID-19 lockdown measures while campaigning. One arrest in November 2020 sparked protests from his supporters, leading to violent clashes with security forces, which resulted in the deaths of more than 50 people and injuries to many others. Additionally, government forces imposed restrictions on media coverage of opposition leaders and their campaigns, with reports of opposition supporters being abducted. The election took place on January 14, 2021. Unlike previous elections, the event saw a significant reduction in the number of international monitors approved to observe the proceedings. The Electoral Commission declared Museveni the victor, stating he had received over 58% of the vote, while Wine was reported to have garnered around 35%. After casting his vote, Wine was placed under house arrest, which severely limited his ability to meet with other party leaders during the critical period for contesting the election results. The High Court ordered his release on January 25th, but by then, the window for challenging the election results had narrowed. A week later, Wine filed a petition with the Supreme Court seeking to overturn the election results. He cited the harassment of his supporters and claimed overwhelming evidence of electoral fraud. However, he ultimately withdrew his challenge weeks later, expressing concerns about the court's bias. He noted that the court had rejected his attempts to submit additional evidence supporting his claims of fraudulent activities. Meanwhile, the parliamentary elections held in January also resulted in the NRM securing approximately two-thirds of the seats, while Wine's NUP claimed about one-tenth of the parliamentary positions, making it the second largest party after the NRM. The political climate surrounding the campaign and election period of 2020-2021 came under scrutiny in March 2022, when Human Rights Watch released a report detailing unlawful detentions and torture of opposition party supporters and government critics by state forces. In the realm of foreign affairs, Uganda faced international backlash in the late 1990s for its involvement in the civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. After numerous attempts at resolution, Ugandan troops completed their withdrawal from the DRC in 2003. In December 2005, the International Court of Justice found Uganda guilty of unlawful military intervention in the DRC, stating that Uganda's military had violated international human rights and humanitarian laws while exploiting the country's natural resources. The court ruled that Uganda owed reparations to the DRC. Since then, Uganda has maintained a military presence in various other countries. In Somalia, Ugandan troops have been part of an African Union force since 2007, a move that has generally received praise from the international community. However, Uganda's intervention in South Sudan on behalf of the government during the civil war that erupted in December 2013 has been met with more criticism. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of Uganda's tumultuous history and the impact of its leaders, particularly Idi Amin and Yoweri Museveni. From the brutal dictatorship of Amin to the ongoing political struggles under Museveni's rule, we've witnessed the complexities and challenges that have shaped the nation. As we reflect on these events, it's essential to recognize the resilience of the Ugandan people and their continued quest for stability, democracy, and human rights. The road ahead remains fraught with obstacles, but the spirit of the Ugandan people endures. If you found this documentary insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analyses of history and current events. Your support helps us continue to bring you these important stories. Thank you for watching.